would eat Kraft Dinner. Of course we would. We just eat more.
If I had $1 million, I'd be rich.
All right, welcome back, folks, for the last two videos of our course. In these two videos, we're going to take a look at two scholars who are debating what to do where the ethical rubber meets the metaphorical policy road. And that's just kind of a silly analogy, but I think over the course of these two videos, you're going to see what I mean by it. Martha Nussbaum and Sylvie de Newland are using some ethical concepts that are familiar to us. They talk, for instance, about dilemmas regarding the balance between feminist equality and cultural sensitivity. So their ethics will be familiar to us. That's the ethical rubber. But what we're going to focus on is where it meets the policy road. What we're going to take a look at in their views is how they're concerned with the ways that economists and policy experts put these concepts into action. In particular, we're going to see how both of them are concerned with how we measure the results of development policies, and particularly in India, although the same questions could be asked about policies that are used elsewhere as well. They think and they argue that our measurements should be sensitive enough to account for the differences between, say, men and women, young and old, the able-bodied and disabled, and members of different cultures as well, issues that we've studied this entire semester. So measurement should not be, as it sometimes is for economists, one size fits all. There is no universal human out there who simply is or isn't, for instance, well-fed, is or isn't free, is or isn't wealthy. There are just a diverse array of people experiencing the same circumstances very differently, and we have to have measures that account for that. So if we don't measure results well, we could end up getting stuck with two problems, which these two videos will be about. So here's one aspect of the hashtag issue. We could believe that a development policy is having a great effect when the numbers come in, when we see average numbers like average levels of poverty or hunger or something like that, when we see those move in a good direction. But we could actually be kidding ourselves because women or poor children or the disabled or the sick might actually be making no progress at all because all of the development aid is being used by men or the wealthy, the able-bodied, the well, or even people of a particular subculture. So that's going to be the topic of our first video. Yet at the same time, we have to be sensitive to other aspects of gender and culture and ability and other differences. This is the other part of the hashtag issue, which we're going to cover in our second video. A question will arise there whether we can force women or children or members of particular cultures to do certain things because we believe these things are measurably good for their well-being. Would we be insensitive to their cultures, for instance? Would we be insensitive to their own agency, their ability to make choices, if we forced them to do certain things for their own good? Would we be paternalistic? Martha Nussbaum says, yes, so we should try not to do that. We should change our measurements so that we know if there are differential and unfair results of our policies, but for cultural reasons and for reasons of freedom, we shouldn't force people to achieve certain results. But Sylvie de Newland responds, yes, it's paternalistic, but we must do it. That debate we're going to see in our second video. But let's get to our first question of measurement. Nussbaum can be thought of, generally speaking, as part of a movement that's called development and human rights. So let me spend the rest of this video actually explaining that general field to you, all to sort of explain the background to the specific critiques that Nussbaum makes in Chapter 1, Section 3, a critique of how economists used to measure growth. Okay, so development and human rights is really a field of study at the intersection of three more traditional fields. It combines the political philosophy of human rights, a political science field called democratization, and an economics field called development economics. And those in this particular area, development and human rights, assert that if we want to see the economic development of countries out there, developing countries, obviously, we must first be concerned with whether or not these countries are extending human rights to their people, and with whether or not there's a passively functioning democracy in those countries. Now, they have a lot of reasons for this. The first set of reasons is instrumental. For reasons that I'm going to tell you about in this video, they think that extending human rights and democracy to people will, in fact, in ways that are verifiable by economic science, measurable, lead to greater increases in wealth and income for a very wide swath of people within the developing country. But their reasoning for combining these fields is ethical as well. Maybe these scholars are suggesting human rights and democracy just are the purposes of development. Maybe what we should care about is less the wealth or the income that people may have by some economic measures, but what they are able to do with their wealth and income. For instance, what good is $100 if you can't achieve anything you value, or that your society values, or that would win you the respect of others that you care about? If your society doesn't afford you the human rights to make certain valued choices, who cares how much money you have? And can we really say that any development policy helps the people of a developing country to achieve the ends they value if they don't have some sort of democratic control over the making of that policy? How else would we know what ends they do, in fact, value if they don't have some voice in that process? Now, in countries like America, we argue about different things, perhaps. We argue about taxation and redistributive policies and etc. And people take many valid positions within those debates. But our arguments are about how to achieve freedom and how to achieve perhaps an equality of a certain sort within an already wealthy country. Development and human rights scholars would say, look, before there can be any decisions made about how to treat the economic products of society, there has to be economic product, and there has to be, in a certain sense, society as well, in the sense that the members of society participate in setting the social goals of their policy. So the old and frankly somewhat tired debates within a country like America about free markets or redistribution or welfare policies or work requirements or whether taxes inhibit growth and etc. Well, whatever you think about those just aren't applicable to countries that are in different situations. So these newer scholars are suggesting in a certain sense that traditional economic development theorists had just taken a stand within the wrong debate. They said, well, look, just open up markets and let individuals be free and developing countries will prosper. And they did open up markets, and the countries didn't prosper. So regardless of the question of whether or not that's the right or the ethical policy, regardless of the question of whether it's the practical policy or the one that will lead to most growth in developing countries, these newer scholars are saying we have to consider what that stance does in the developing world. And one thing they think we need to reconsider is the measurements that economists use. So these newer scholars arrived at what we're going to call the critique of growth. The first part of that critique is that growth under a system of pure libertarian free trade results, in developing countries at least, in wealth being unevenly distributed. Those who control the resources end up controlling the product of those resources, and because of politics and civil wars and other reasons, resources in many developing countries are concentrated in a very few hands, and they don't end up filtering out to others. Now, you might sense, yeah, there is an element of moral critique within that statement, but that's not really the whole point here. The idea of these newer scholars is that inequality in wealth is also a drag on development itself. If more people had resources in their hands across the board, then more people could engage in enterprise and in trade with each other, and therefore they could faster increase the stock of wealth that exists within a society. And for that reason, even some classical economists like Adam Smith recommended at least some redistribution. His own United Kingdom was highly unequal in its distribution of land, and he said that's going to inhibit growth. So the development and human rights scholars say, look, some more equality of distribution is actually going to unleash people's creative energies, their entrepreneurship, their ability to make wealth for themselves. But they also have a second critique under that rubric of the critique of growth. And this critique is that when wealth is so unevenly distributed in a developing country, oligarchy and not democracy is the inevitable result. So society, in a certain sense, is crushed by wealth, at least in the sense that many people have no say in setting goals. And again, there is a moral element to this critique, but also again, there's more to it than that. Lack of democracy is also, they say, a drag on development, where the people of a nation can't express their own wishes to their leaders and, more importantly, can't throw their leaders out when those leaders aren't responsive to the people's wishes, then policies are going to be chosen which concentrate wealth in the hands of the oligarchs, discouraging widespread economic activity and stifling economic growth. So, for instance, one of the reasons why there's a chapter from the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen on your syllabus is because he's demonstrated in his work that there are no famines in democracies. And that might sound really strange to you. But what? No famines in democracies? Surely democracies also experience the kind of changes in weather and climate that lead to reduced growth of food and so forth, seasonal changes that might have serious effects. Yeah, no, he doesn't deny that. He says there are no famines in democracies. Why? Because democratic leaders actually have the incentive, a very strong incentive, not to get thrown out of office. They have a very strong incentive to see to it that grain is stored, for instance, that there's a policy in place which actually helps the country to acquire food from other countries in times of scarcity, right? That the people are actually taken care of. Now, public policy schools had been looking at this type of development and human rights literature for 2 decades. Within the past decade or so, economics departments started doing it as well. So some of you are going to be familiar with these critiques. And you might be asking to yourself, well, how did the older economists even fail to see these things? Well, the idea that Martha Nussbaum puts forward is that they just measured stuff wrong. That's the critique she's offering. They measured GDP per capita, the average amount of wealth held in a country. And on a measure like that, Saudi Arabia looks to have grown a lot over the past 50 years, and Saudis look to be almost as wealthy as Europeans. There's about $55,000 per person in GDP there. But wealth is unevenly distributed in Saudi Arabia, and some people don't have the resources to be involved in trade or business. And political scientists say that about, say, $15,000 to $20,000 in per capita GDP is necessary to sustain a democracy. And they say that countries over this mark are generally at least passable democracies. The idea here is almost as old as Aristotle. It's that a large middle class, when it has a stake in the wealth of its country, tends to demand and sustain a stake in its government as well. That makes them demand some sort of democratic input. But Saudi Arabia is one of the few countries in the world that defies this trend, and many of the others are petrostates in the Middle East as well. If you didn't have anything but the measure of GDP per capita, you wouldn't know why. And not only do you not have democracy in Saudi Arabia, but as you all know, some relatively severe restrictions on women as well. Saudi women only won the right to drive a car 3 years ago. They were allowed to vote and run for office in municipal elections only 9 years ago. But nevertheless, some activists say the situation for Saudi women is getting worse, not better. So here's the point. If you only measured GDP per capita and its growth, you'd miss all of this. You'd miss the barriers that come in the way of economic participation for so many. You'd miss the facts that the underpinnings of democracy and democratic participation just aren't there. And you'd miss that cultural factors like gender norms are keeping some people from being able to enjoy the benefits of all that economic growth. As we're going to see in our next video, Nussbaum and Denulin say you just have to take account of all of these things, and you have to do it in your measurements.